The case that we're going to talk about today is one about multiple lives being destroyed. Not only the actual victim in this case, the victim's family, as well as the perpetrator's family. This case is about lies, about deceit, about mistrust, and about dishonesty at the heart of it. Now, also, what is going to take place in this case is we will see two secret lives, two secret wives on a crash course collision towards each other. And when it got right to that point where James Addie could have either done at least one honorable thing and just ended it all and come clean, he chose not to do that, and instead he let those two worlds collide. And now at the end of it, one person's no longer here and another family is left to pick up the pieces of a life that they had no idea that their father and husband was living. James Addie was married to his wife Melanie for a little over 20 years. Now, they had two children together, a son who was in college and then a daughter, Emma, who was 17 at the time that this incident took place. Now, she would be 20 years old at the time of the trial, and sadly, Emma, as well as her mother, Melanie, would have to take the stand in this case. Molly Watson was a mother, a sister, a friend, and she was also an entrepreneur. She had her own indie nail polish line. Now, one thing that Molly also thought she was a bride-to-be, to have a dream wedding and to marry a man whom she had been going out with for 7 years. James Addie, the man at the center of all this destruction, he was 54 years old and he was a correctional officer at one of the prisons there locally. Now, what we're going to do in this video today is we're going to go over the trial and we're going to talk about some key moments and some key testimony in this trial and go over some of my thoughts and opinions on this completely tragic story. Now, the state's opening in this case really painted a picture of how excited Molly was to be having the wedding of her dreams, marrying the man of her dreams, and all of the planning that went into this. You could really sense that, feeling of excitement, that new page in life, the way the state painted all of this and the evidence that they will show. Now, Molly was planning her dream wedding on April 29th, 2018. Some of the things that the state would outline in the opening were that Molly and James Addie, they went on romantic vacations. They went to Cancun, they went to Disney World. They had literally planned this wedding out, and I'm talking about the guest list, the menu. They were going to have prime rib. The placards were made for the seating assignments, and they even had one that said Miss Addie for Molly's spot. So you can see just how intricate this was. This wasn't, a person, meaning James, that was going towards this event, dragging his feet. He was truly leading this woman on. Now, also in the opening, the state is going to outline the tragic day that Molly's time here on earth was stolen from her by James Addie, and that is April 27th, 2018, literally days before the wedding. Now, Molly's body would be found on a dusty rural road. Her body would be laid near her car, and she would still have her engagement ring on. Now, there would be certain pieces of evidence found along this way and route. Perfect tire track marks, which would come back to haunt James. There would also be a bloody t-shirt, and there would also be an ammo box found along the way, and they would also find Molly's cell phone. All of these things would completely come back on James. Now, while the officers who had been called to the scene, they found the body, and they were there, and they were able to locate Molly's wedding website, like on the internet. They did some searches and found this, and they discovered she was getting ready to get married. So we need to go identify or notify the fiance, and so they set out to do that. As you can imagine, when officers arrived to the house, everybody was in for a huge surprise. The officers quickly learned that James already had a wife and a daughter, and that wife, Melanie, had no idea that any of this was going on. Now, luckily, his daughter, Emma, would sleep through the evening when the police arrived there. She had actually been staying up late to do a school project, and that will also come back to bite James in the butt as far as his alibi goes. But when Emma woke up the next day, remember, she's a teenager in high school. Her world was pulled out from under her. Now at this time, James would tell officers that he got involved with something that he shouldn't have, and he would start unraveling this world to them, and he would show them the secret phone that he used to communicate with Molly. Now of course, James is thinking that he's tidied everything up with fake phone calls and text messages to cover his tracks. One of the lies that would very quickly become unraveled was his timeline. James would tell officers that that day he had gone to hang out with a friend. He got back around 8:30. He talked to Molly for about 20 minutes. Now, Emma, his daughter, remember I said she had been staying up late doing a school project, she would end up during her time talking to officers and stuff would say, well, no, my dad actually got in around 10 o'clock, and I remember that specifically because I was like under the gun for a school project. So she had been staying up late, and she said that his behavior that evening was antsy, that he washed some clothes, she could smell bleach, and did a couple of things like that, was like waiting in the bathroom door for her to finish, and just seemed a little bit off that night. Now again, that timeline and his lies about that will come back to haunt him. And also the state will lay out how Emma would say that the t-shirt that the cops found, that was her t-shirt. And we'll get into more details later about how she knew that shirt was exactly hers. But it ain't looking good for him. Now the state would also outline that when the cops looked at the car that James was driving that night, it was covered in dust, and also it had some scrapes down the side of it, which will come back. And eventually the back right tire of that car will be identified to the tire tracks at the scene of the crime. Now remember, they found Molly's phone. Well, the state will outline in their opening how Molly's phone had an app on it that was like for tracking time and stuff like that, and directions or whatever. And they would be able to track this, and it would match up to one of the phone calls that James had said that he was talking to her on. And that amount of time was the exact amount of time and distance it took when she left her house to the scene of the crime where her and James met up. The state will end their opening by saying, listen to the evidence. And they'll say, look, on April 27th, James made a choice, and it obviously wasn't a good one for Molly. Now, when the defense gets up for their opening, the defense will say, look, you know what? The state of Missouri is asking you to do a whole bunch, and a whole bunch is connecting the dots and filling in the gaps because they don't have solid evidence tying my client to this crime. And he says, not beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, he will have to admit, and he does admit, Jim had an affair. Jim had secret lives. But he says, you know what, we're not on trial for an adulterous affair. We're not on trial for the lies that he did with that. He says that within 6 hours of the police finding out about, Molly, obviously, Molly's death, as well as that James was her, a lover, partner, that they had decided, you know what, this was a secret life, he's guilty. Now, he will also say, my client James was very cooperative. He was letting them look at the phone, look at the car. He, like just a few days ago before all that happened, had dropped $4,000 on the wedding. So he's like, this doesn't make sense. Why would he take out his bride-to-be? Again, he says there's no scientific evidence that can link him to this. Now, earlier in pre-trial type stuff, the defense would try to get the tire evidence thrown out, and the defense will actually do a good job in this trial shaking up the state's expert about the tires. Okay, so now let's talk about some key parts of the testimony and some key witnesses that came up on the stand in this trial. Now, the Monroe County Sheriff Joe Colston would take the stand. Now, this gentleman was on the scene. He was one of the people who was participating in identifying Molly at the scene of the crime and coming to the realization of she was getting ready to get married and we need to go to the home and notify the fiance. Now, a key piece of testimony and a key witness to this is Glenn Mcsparron. And Glenn Mcsparron actually interrupted James Addie when he was trying to clean up the scene. Again, so for sidebar on this for a second, I love how when these people try and get away with stuff like this, that first of all, obviously it never works out. Secondly, that things like this happen, like by the grace of God or whatever, whoever, someone is sent along the way to thwart their plans, and Glenn is one of those people. Now, Glenn would take the stand to testify. Now, there's a couple of things going on here. Glenn can't make a positive identification to say, yes, it was James Addie that I saw, But I mean, the circumstantial aspect surrounding his, dealing with James that night is pretty overwhelming. So what Glenn would say is that he was taking his daughter to her grandmother's, and he was taking a shortcut, and that's why he was on this road. This road is, I mean, it looks like, it's a dusty dirt road, a backwoods road, so it's kind of surprising that somebody ran into somebody back there. So he said he was going, he sees two cars facing each other, and he does actually interact with a guy who's at the cars for very briefly. And he's like, I couldn't, the lights were bright. I couldn't make a positive identification on him. But he was like, the guy was acting, shady. Like there's something off with him. And he said that also, this made him say, you know what, I'm going to swing back by that way. So about 20 minutes later, he swings back by that way, and this is when the body of Molly and her car is discovered. So you do the math on that. Now, he would say, yeah, you know what, I can't 100% say that that's James, but he said it was an older male driving a dark, big, grandma-like type car. So James is an older male. He drives a very large, dark, burgundy red, whatever you want to call it, kind of grandma-ish car. So, there's that. Now, again, lucky for Glenn, he could have been another victim, and thank God he wasn't. Now, apparently what would happen is when James was getting away and going away from this, he would swerve over, and he would brush his car up against the dusty embankment. Now, remember how I mentioned earlier about the car, and I'm going to put photos up, and it had the dust marks and the scrapes on the side, and then the right tire was on the embankment. That will come back to bite James in the butt. Now, y'all, this next bit of testimony was absolutely gut-wrenching, heartbreaking. And the testimony that I'm speaking of is Emma Addie, James's daughter. Now, when she came out, James literally was crying, as he should be. And again, so if a sidebar on this, I will say this: James, in my opinion, throughout this trial, held his head in shame. You didn't have to wait for the jury to go out, because his face, his demeanor, his eyes said all you needed to know. And again, as he should. How many times do we see these perpetrators who are sitting there making fun of the victims, taunting the families, trying to lie every which way? James looked like the POS that he was, and that he knew he was one. Anyways, I'm on a rant. Let's continue. So now, remember, like I said earlier, she was 17 when this happened. Now she's 20 years old, and remember, she's in high school. She's doing homework. She's doing school projects. The prom's going on, and her world gets turned upside down over this next level BS that her father has drugged their family into and stolen someone's life over. So my heart goes out to all these people. But she would take the stand against her father, and if there is ever any damning testimony so perfectly wrapped up for the state, it's this. Now, Emma would actually say that she had met Molly a few years back, but she was like, I didn't know that this was my dad's, girlfriend. I just thought it was a friend of some sort. And so that was, creepy. Now, remember how the state outlined in the opening statements how Emma's timeline contradicted James's timeline. So Emma would testify about this, and she would say, yeah, you know what? I had the school project we were doing. I had to stay up late. Mom had gone to bed. I was up. And she's like, I remember specifically Dad coming in at 10 o'clock. And she said when she was finally getting ready to go to bed, that's when her dad just kind of stood in the bathroom door waiting on her. And she would say, yeah, he seemed antsy. And yeah, he did some laundry, used bleach, and something just seemed a little bit off about his behavior. Now, remember how I said there was a t-shirt found at the scene? Well, Emma's testimony about this sealed the deal, in my opinion. So Emma had done a school project, and it was I guess they were making t-shirts of some sort. So she had made 3 t-shirts. Well, in her, however they were doing it, the imprint, the design on the front or whatever, she said that she was the only person in her class that did it wrong, and so hers came out incorrectly. These were not generic t-shirts. These were very specific, unique t-shirts. And so she said, you know what, I gave them to my dad to use as rags in the garage or whatever. One of those shirts would be found at the scene of the crime with Molly's DNA on it, blood on it, gunshot residue on it, and then they would find 2 more of the shirts in the garage at James, Melanie, and Emma's house. So yeah, that is literally wrapping up the evidence with a gold bow and handing it to the state. And sadly, it's his daughter that has to get up there and say that. How gut-wrenching that must have been. Now, another heartbreaking testimony was Melanie getting on the stand. Now, this is the wife, the former wife, I'm sure at this point, of James Addie. Melanie would describe her marriage how I think a lot of people probably would. It was good, it was bad sometimes, you know, it was a marriage. There was nothing that really jumped out about her testimony to say there was like huge issues or anything of that nature. Now, she would say, I had no idea that this was going on. I didn't find this out until we were woken up by police officers. And I'm just like, can you imagine? Oh my God, it just sends shivers down my spine. Now, Melanie would say that the night of the crime, that when James left the house, he was wearing a black jacket, and she was never able to find that jacket again. Now, while she's on the stand, the state will establish that obviously Melanie is alive. Now, the reason this is important is because in October of 2017, James would sign a form, number 1, saying that he was divorced from Melanie. And then later on, as things approached, he would tell Molly that Melanie was killed in a car wreck. And that would also be part of the story that would, it seems through evidence, made Molly start saying, something doesn't seem right. But also this whole fact of, you know, why this is relevant that she's still alive, besides the obvious, is because, you know, Molly and James would end up getting a marriage license. So, I mean, that's how deep this lie and dishonesty ran. Now, the state backs this up with a line of questioning, and they bring up the fact that Molly had sent their wedding planner an email, and I guess they were trying to like make a date for something or whatever. And Molly's like, look, we're gonna have to wing it. My fiance's ex-wife died this past weekend from a car wreck that happened in December. You can sit here and piece it together, and let's sofa sidebar it. She's being told, okay, months later, you know, that the wife, Melanie, died from injuries that came from a car wreck the last Christmas time. You can see the level of the lie that he has been telling, and I'm sure each way it had a reason, each turn, each level this lie went up to, there was reasoning in his world for it. But you can also see how it was going to get to a point where you have to do something if you want to continue somehow, if you want to keep everything intact. And I'm imagining this is how he thought, as opposed to just, you know, washing your hands of the situation and coming clean that you've been cheating on people and all this stuff. But in his world, it looks like he got to the level where everyone was going to find out, and there was only one option in his world. Now, while on the stand, Melanie would also testify about this loft area in their garage that she really never went up to. And so she went up there, and she would find photo albums of James and Molly, and like trips to, you know, like I said, Disneyland, Cancun. Underneath her own nose in her own house, you know, this guy is like stashing away the secret life there. When questioned about these trips, Melanie would say, I knew he was going to Florida because he had said that he was going for training. And she said, you know what, there's actually even a letter with the correctional facility's letterhead, you know, stating all the stuff that had to happen for this training. It was for sniper training. So again, look at the level that he is doing to cover up his tracks and to get away with the secret life with Molly. And then poor Molly, you have to sit here the whole time and be like, my God, this poor young lady. She was obviously in love with this guy, you know, and you can only imagine the lies he was telling her. You can only imagine how many times he brushed her off or didn't answer a phone call at a certain time, you know, trying to hide all this. I mean, it's just so awful. Now, about the Mexico trip, Melanie would say that James told her this was like a trip with friends or whatever. Another interesting thing that the state would bring out through questioning was about the fact of James and Melanie doing separate vacations. And she would have Melanie say, yeah, you know what, he didn't like me to go on vacations by myself or trips because that might give me an opportunity to cheat on him. And I was like, you have got to be kidding. I mean, if this is not narcissistic 101, just gaslighting, you name it, it absolutely sends shivers down my spine and red ants through my bloodstream. Now, when the defense gets up there to question Melanie, he'll do a few things that I'm like, this just doesn't go well. Melanie clearly is a very sympathetic person because she had no idea this was going on. This isn't like she was involved in this affair, anything like that. Like, these women, both the victim and Melanie, they had no idea about this. So to get up there and kind of try and ruffle her feathers, I'm like, not good. Now, the defense would talk about their spending habits, and the defense would try and pivot Melanie in a situation or a light of her being controlling over money, wanting to, give permission for him spending money and things like this. And she was like, look, I'm not trying to have more control over his money. I'm trying to have him be more responsible with his money. And the defense would bring up things like, well, didn't you accuse him of buying things without your permission? And didn't you burn some stuff that he bought one time? And all these things that she was denying. Now, after he accuses her of burning things, he goes back to his table, and one of his co-workers or whoever, defense counsel, whispers something, and then he's like, no more questioning. So I would love to know what she said, because I felt like if she could have said anything, it would have been, dude, you need to reel it in while you can, because you are not winning points with this jury. Now, the state gets back up there, and I love her questioning. And she's like, would you have approved of a $4,000 down payment on a wedding that your husband was planning to have to another woman that you didn't know about? You already know what her answer is. No, of course. And she's like, thank you, done. I mean, it is true. If she was this controlling over his money and was all up in it, she would have seen huge red flags. I mean, again, like I said, a $4,000 payment that went down, and that was like the remaining deposit. So there was obviously large amounts of money and large amounts of lying, because she probably didn't know where his money was going. Clearly, we see where it was going. Now, another part of the defense's questioning would be about guns and the possession of these guns and whatnot. This is where the defense really tried to ruffle her up, and it did not go very well. So the defense would be like, have you testified in this manner before about your husband's guns and where he kept them and things like that? And she's like, I don't think so. And they kind of go back and forth with this, and you can tell he's trying to set something up. So then he goes over to her and hands her a deposition, and he says, find in there where you've testified about it before. And bless her heart, she's sitting there kind of confused, because when they did it, I thought this to myself. I said, please God, don't make her read that entire thing right now. And if they do, I would be like, I need to go to the bathroom first or something. I mean, stop the damn cameras. Let me go get some popcorn. I don't know, but this is all no. And so she's sitting there kind of like, do you want me to read this? Now, finally, the state jumps in and says, look, that question was never even in this deposition, so you can't ask her something that she never answered. And that line of questioning, goes away. Thank God. Now, another witness that would get up there is the state's expert, who would testify about the tire tracks that were left and matching those up. And actually, this is a place where the defense was able to ruffle him up on the stand and kind of leave you with a type vibe. What this gentleman is testifying about is about how he determines that the tires are a match. And he's talking about how he measures points and different, anomalies and things like that on the tires to say, yep, this is the tire. This is the exact tire type thing. So the defense will get up there, and we see this in many trials where the defense wants to discredit the witness. They want to really tear apart the process of how they go about this. Now, unfortunately, this state's expert, he's not really good at explaining himself or having that pressure put on him. And essentially, he's saying, I can't really explain how I do the matching. And he's like, I mean, I could walk over to the board and show you, but they don't want to go that route. But the damage is kind of done on that, and where it ends up leaving you is with this question of that testimony or that science isn't really that finessed type thing. Now, mind you, you can just simply look at the pictures, and I mean, granted, this does not count in a court of law, but for us over here on the sofa, I looked at it and I was like, looks good enough to me, let's fry. Now, also in this trial, text messages, phone records, internet searches would all come up, and these are another tragic part of this, because it's like you're hearing from Molly herself. And because the state did such a good job at making a human out of Molly for people who never met her, and also in that showing the excitement that she had about this wedding, it just makes it that much harder to look at what's going on. And we know as the viewers what ended up happening. And it's like you just want to go back in time and be like, oh my God, don't go meet him. So remember how I had said the thing about James telling Molly that his ex-wife had died in a car wreck. Well, literally like a couple of days before this happened, Molly starts doing all of these internet searches about Melanie, Addie's obituary and all this stuff. And she actually finally kind of calls it out. She's like, did they have, because she can't find any sign of, this obituary. And she's basically like, look, is what's going on, did maybe your, kids have the funeral already and they just didn't tell you, or something like that. She's trying to get him to talk. And he's like, no, it's this weekend, I'm telling you, but again, that's one of those things where I'm like, oh yeah, that would be a telltale sign, because they did not live that far away. I'm going to say maybe tops an hour away from each other. So this isn't like we're talking out of state or whatever. It was just far enough away, but regardless, I mean, you're gonna find some kind of evidence of this. Another sad piece of evidence that we'll see is a text message for the night of the incident. Now, James texts Molly and he's like, it looks like I'm gonna get to see you tonight. And she writes back and she's like, yay. And he writes back and says, you don't mean that. And you're just like, oh my God, like he totally knew, like what he was already planning on doing that. Now, like I said before, he'll make like fake phone calls to his phone. He'll make fake text messages, things of this nature. We see these dudes do this, or men and women, whoever, do this all the time, where they think that they can make a phone call to the person's phone that they just took out, and that's going to make it look like they were actually concerned about where this person was. But you can sit here, and the state does bring this up, and they're like, look, this was like not even long enough to like go to voicemail. It's like, come on. And then when they show the evidence of the phone call and the distance that it was from Molly's house to the meeting point, it was the exact amount of the phone call that James is trying to make it out like he was, back home or whatever. So that part, it's very damning, and it's just very sad to see. Now, the closing arguments in this case were delivered on what would have been their third wedding anniversary. Now, the state will reiterate, he had the secret relationship with Molly for 7 years. Over here, he was married to Melanie for 23 years. This wedding date, this new life is fast approaching with Molly, and he ended up making a very lethal decision as to how to handle that, because these two worlds were on a crash collision course. The state will also bring up the wedding planner in the closing, as well as some of the testimony the wedding planner provided. Now, the wedding planner would have said, days before the wedding, they cut their guest list by like 50%. Also, his son had not even been fitted for a tuxedo, and obviously Emma, and she testified to this too, never even received an invitation. That was very damning. Now, also, the wedding planner had said, and the state brings this up in the closing, around this time, a couple of days before, how James had told the wedding planner that, his fiance is really, getting on his nerves and this kind of thing. And it didn't sound like a jestful type thing, like it sounded like he meant it. Now, again, the state will walk through that evening, and she talks about how, James that night, would end up sleeping in the same bed with his wife after he does all this. The state will outline how it's obvious Molly was starting to get suspicious. She was asking questions. Is this funeral really happening? Are you getting cold feet? This kind of thing. The state also outlines the fake alibi text. So he texts himself at 5:30 and then leaves the house at 7. Between 8:06 and 8:26, Molly is texting him her last text messages, and then they get on the phone at 8:30. Now, that's when Molly gets in her car and she heads towards James on this backwoods dusty road. And the state will say after he's done doing what he did to her, he threw her out like a piece of garbage. Now, the state reiterates the guy, Glenn, who testified, that ran into this while James was cleaning the scene up. And the state says, yeah, you know what, he can't 100% identify him, but come on. I mean, who else was going to be on that road at these two cars and leave, and then Molly's body is there? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. Now, the state also shows the route home from this location to James, as well as the key points on this route home where they found these objects, the ammo box, the t-shirt, all of this damning evidence. Now, the state also says, you know what, he didn't count on Emma being awake. That was a huge blow to his alibi. Now, the defense gets up for their closing, and their theme is going to be a lot of times what we see with most defense attorneys. His theme is going to be reasonable doubt and not enough evidence. He will reiterate, Missouri is asking you to do their job. They are asking you to fill in the gaps. They are asking you to connect the dots. There is nothing here that shows my client did this beyond a reasonable doubt. And he goes as far as to tell the jurors, he's like, your reasonable doubts, they're legit, because Jim didn't do this. And he makes sure to call him Jim, which I think is interesting. But, you know, he tells the jury, and I'm like, dude, I don't think they're having reasonable doubt at this point, but I get it. You know, he has to defend the guy. This is what it is. We would all want a defense attorney, and he has to work with what he's given. And I can tell you this, y'all, he was not given anything but a lick and a damn prayer. Now, he reiterates, yes, you know what? Jim had an affair. He did this. It's, you know, it's not a good thing, but we're not on trial for that. Now, he also says, you know what, his relationship with his wife was strained. They fought over money. There was no intimacy, this and that. And he says, but look, all the evidence will show with text messages that James loved Molly and they were getting ready to start a life. Who drops $4,000 on a wedding and then offs their spouse in a couple of days? And I'm like, I think I know one person who does, and he's sitting at your table. Now, in regards to the shirt that was found, the defense will say, you know, is it really like impossible to think that a fiance would have a shirt from their partner? And while I agree, sure, that is technically possible, I'm just like, come on, like, we're really grabbing at straws here at this point. Now, the defense will end by saying, you know what, there was never a proper investigation done. They made their minds up about Jim and his guilt within hours after discovering this secret life. Now, the state would get back up one more time for another close in their rebuttal statements, and they would say, yeah, you know what, we get it, that he's not on trial for adultery and, you know, the secret life. But they will say, you know what, the adultery led him to taking Molly's life, and his lies led him to that defendant chair right there. Now, the state will also say, you know what, yeah, the defense is saying that he was cooperative with law enforcement in the investigation. And she says, but I want to correct that. He appeared to be cooperative, because that's how James lived, keeping up appearances. He was a master at it because that's what he did for 7 years, and God only knows before that. And I thought that was an excellent point to make. Now, she mentions the fact that James had told other inmates that he laid someone face down in a ditch as to why he was in there. And she brings back up the fact that the wedding planner had said, you know, days before the wedding, he's talking about Molly's driving him crazy. Now, the state will leave the jurors with a picture of a card from their wedding. And the state will say, you know what, it wasn't James' promises of love that came true for Molly. She said, but it was rather her death that came true. And there's not going to be any of these sweet tomorrows for Molly, because James decided that that wasn't going to happen for her ever. Now, y'all, it took the jury 2.5 hours to find him guilty on both charges. Those charges were first-degree murder and armed criminal action. There would also be victim impact statements. And again, I felt like the state did such a good job at showing us Molly as a person and not just, you know, a person involved in a case. And so when we hear these victim impact statements, it just resonates that much more. Now, Molly has a son, and he wrote a letter, and one of the lawyers would read this. Now, her son would say that, you know what, James took her away from me, and that she was a good person, she was a good mother, she was a good friend. Now, her son would also write that he felt like his mother had always made good decisions for him, but he felt like she only made one truly bad decision in her lifetime, and that was to be with James. Now, the son would also say that the only reason that Molly, his mother, believed James and his lies is because she loved him and looked past those flaws. Now, we'd also hear from Molly's brother, Tim, and Tim would say, you know what, Molly would do anything for her son. Now, Tim would also say how her son was a preemie baby, and so he had some special needs at times, and how that was Molly's life, her world, was making sure that her son was taken care of. Now, Tim, just like her son, would describe Molly as not just a sister, but a friend and an amazing human being. Now, in contrast to her being so wonderful, he would describe James for what he was, and that's a monster. Now, sadly, Molly and Tim's parents would both leave this earth before they were able to see justice for their daughter. And my heart just goes out to that. It gives me goosebumps right now thinking that, again, if you look at the victimization in this case that this man calls the devastation, I just am like, imagine this happens to your child. And there's tons of people out there like this right now in these situations and all these cases we look at. And you leave this earth never knowing truly what happened and never seeing the perpetrator, you know, get what's coming to them. So my heart goes out to her family. Now, James's sister would also speak on his behalf before sentencing, and she would say, you know what, he's been a good brother to me. He's always been there for me, even the years that he was incarcerated. And she was very tearful. And, you know, I'm sure that this is a heartbreak to all the people who his actions and inactions and lies touched. Now, while that first degree charge is going to have an automatic sentence to it, and that will come later, they're going to do sentencing for that later, the other charge, armed criminal action, the jury gets to decide that. They went out, deliberated, and they came back with 20 years for that. Not that it matters in the sense of, obviously, he's never leaving prison, but you never know with appeals and stuff like that, so it's at least good to have two of those different things going in case something ever were to happen in the future. Now, again, I want to say one last time, my heart goes out to Molly, all of her family members, all the people who loved her. My heart goes out to Emma and Melanie for their lives being completely destroyed and uprooted by that monster. And especially for Emma, because I just feel like what a precarious spot to be put in by your own father. That has to be really confusing with a lot of different emotions, especially at that age. So my heart goes out to all of the victims in this case. Now, if you want to watch some more of my coverage of trials like this, you can click the playlist that I've attached. It's going to be popping up now. Also, if you like to watch like movie reviews and things of that nature, I have a movie review channel. I'm going to put a little screen of it right now, and the description is in the link below in the description box. So you can check that out. And that's it. Thank you to all the viewers, the subscribers, the watchers, the Patreons, and channel members. Thank you to everybody who likes, comments, and shares the videos. It's what makes the channel thrive and stay alive. And that's it. Until next time, I will see you later, and so will Mr. Roscoe.